South Africans are well aware of the problems that our SOEs face, and privatization is one of those business models that has often been discussed as a possible solution towards these problems. I recently attended an event held by the University of Pretoria, which discusses privatization with the lens of working towards profitability. We pick up the debate at the beginning.
Now, South Africa has a state-to-market and back-to-state history with regards to privatization. The following quote by economist Iraj Abidjan, who in May 2016 stated that it is common knowledge that the SOEs have been the playground of patrimonial political leadership, crony capitalism, and manifest rent-seeking over the past decade. As a result, the organizational integrity has been severely compromised, the balance sheets hollowed out, and their corporate brands largely destroyed. Our focus this evening is most definitely not on all the issues we read and hear and in the Zondo Commission. We will have a constructive discussion. And the question we ask is it time to renew the 2000 to 2008 conversation around privatization of the SOEs in South Africa? And we'll kick off with a basic discussion. And Thomas, no pressure, I'll start with you. What are the drawbacks of privatization that we must be aware of?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this particular discussion. Very good discussion indeed. I think the first thing that one needs to bring to the table is that privatization is not necessarily a guarantee of success. And a couple of things that I want to highlight here as well is that in an unequal society, you tend to find that you might find the privatization situation leading to a situation where you have a concentration of power. So the few rich people who've got access to resources are the ones who are able to buy into these particular companies as well. So it is something that we need to be, aware of. One of the things about bringing, private sector into perhaps state-owned entities, you find that the profit motive becomes the primary key in terms of, strategic objectives as well. And you find that, other stakeholders tend to take a backseat, like your employees, the environment, that tends to suffer as a result of that incentive that is given to managers and shareholders. And if you look at some of the entities as well that they can be disadvantaged by, privatization, is a large part of the revenue that we generate out of state-owned entities and profits, if possible, they go back into the fiscus. And when you bring, privatization into that particular component of the governance government, you might find yourself now being less in terms of income that you generate as a state-owned entity. Of course, this is dependent on a particular environment and particular market conditions as well. But you might be losing out as a government in a sense of revenue as well. And you might also be encouraging a huge part of inequality to continue within a society where the dominant, resource holders are the ones who participate into these equities.
Perspective, thank you. Andre, what has changed in our thinking around the concept of privatization?
I think in today's world, we've got a more nuanced approach to privatization and the involvement of the private sector. I think privatization, frankly, is a bit of a 1980s word. It's a bit of a Thatcherite concept of essentially selling off state assets and reducing state involvement in the economy. And I would agree with Thomas. I think we need to be quite nuanced when we think about the involvement of the private sector in the areas traditionally reserved for state-owned enterprises. So, for example, if one were to privatize the Eskom transmission grid, you would be privatizing a natural monopoly. And any economist would tell you that private control over a natural monopoly could lead to the extraction of monopoly rents by private actors. So one has to think very carefully how one structures state-owned enterprises to enable us to attract private capital into those areas. We know that we need, for example, in South Africa, additional electricity generation capacity, and we know that the state doesn't have the money to afford that. So how do we enable private investors to have the necessary confidence to invest in those new projects, while at the same time protecting the consumer from the extraction of monopoly rents. And it's therefore, in my opinion, a very nuanced discussion, and one needs to have a balance between the unfettered pursuit of profits, the achievement of certain very worthy socioeconomic objectives, and the discipline that the profit motive of the private sector imposes on how money is spent and how businesses are run in terms of the most optimal efficiencies. So I don't think, to answer your question in brief, that this is a binary set of choices that we face. I think there's a far more modulated approach that we need to take to finding the correct balance between private sector and the state. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Andre. As academics, we ask critical questions based on science and scientific thinking. So I want to pose a question in an academic view to Lebogang and Wesley firstly. What can you add to Andre's perspective based on the most recent research findings on privatization? Lebogang, let's start with you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a good one, isn't it? I think basically, especially given what's been happening right now with the COVID moment and COVIDnomics, there are quite a few things that have emerged, and these include the understanding that, in fact, privatization at this time has led to a massive, quite an insidious decrease in state intervention, and there's a real push towards large-scale capital investments, large-scale private capital investments. And of course, privatization has always been one of the pillars that has, against development, the idea of equitable development economics. And it was advocated as a means to reduce financial and administrative burdens of the government, because after all, the logic of Reagan and Thatcherism, as has been said, is that states are just bulky, they're just too laborious. And yet the thing that happens, of course, is that they're quite increased standard of living often for a few is actually accompanied by the increased cost of living by the majority, and the use of fees to collect costs, of course. The social implications of all of this, because those who can afford the more costly options are going to go for that, and in a context and a situation where the world is not flat, where in fact we need to be investing more in public health, accessible health, affordable health for the majority of people, accessible and affordable education, that seems to be completely counter-logical. And I think the idea that is the only way to grow economies and is the only way to spend our way out of economic crisis, it was really put to the test by scenarios like Taiwan, for example, like Singapore, like Malaysia, and of course that privatization, it is the opposite of public accountability, and one of the disadvantages is that there's often far less public accountability, and of course when we divert from private capital, we then oftentimes run the risk of buying over public sector assets, and economic growth could be retarded rather than being expanded.
Thank you, Lebogang. Wesley, your work is grounded in the business sciences. What's your opinion here?
Thanks, Alex. There's a lot of research on the topic of privatization. What we're seeing of late is that there's growing empirical research that suggests that the association between privatization and better performing companies, profitability, that's quite a strong correlation that's taking place there. We also see that with state-owned entities that have been distressed for long periods of time and are exposed to quite competitive environments, when they privatize, they emerge actually creating jobs rather than the idea of actually losing jobs in the process of privatization. So although, we have this idea that privatization will always lead to job losses, in some circumstances it actually leads to job creation. Also what we see in terms of a lot of studies that have come out is that we see a general trend towards using economic mechanisms to drive customer welfare, and also objectives to be achieved in terms of employment and industrialization. In terms of the general trend across the board, in terms of issues across state-owned enterprises, there's definitely, right across the board, there's this issue around corporate governance, as well as politicalization in terms of affecting state-owned entities, and also the lack of clear objectives. So having said that, that's kind of what's emerging out of the literature at the moment. What we also see is that although these challenges that SOEs are facing, in particular in South Africa, that these are quite surmountable challenges, and that sometimes we resort to privatization in desperation because of these sort of challenges that they're facing.
Thank you, Wes. So, Piso, from a legal point of view, from your world, how might privatization have an impact on vulnerable consumers, potentially?
Thanks for the question. So I think we'd have to, as a first step, define what we're talking about when we refer to vulnerable consumers. And vulnerable consumers would probably, encompass a large majority of the South African population, because here we're talking about people who live in low-income areas. We're talking about people who are illiterate or not fluent in particular languages. We're talking about people who live in low density or rural areas. We're also talking about people who are vulnerable by virtue of their age. So perhaps they are minors or they are people who are overage. And in this respect, there are a number of SOEs which either directly or indirectly service this group of vulnerable consumers. So, for instance, if we look at a state-owned entity such as PRASA, it provides transportation services, and the bulk of the persons who would use this service are vulnerable consumers. PRASA at this stage, for instance, is already, as with many other SOEs, is facing challenges in terms of its governance and its efficiency. And the people who are being impacted on the most are the vulnerable consumers. And if you look at it from an international perspective, in some other developing countries, such as Bangladesh, which have gone from nationalization through to privatization and have seen some of the challenges and pitfalls in either regimes, one thing, although there are definitely some challenges that come with privatization, one thing that seems to be constant when there is an element of privatization is that the unit price of goods and services tends to decrease, obviously resulting from an increase in competition, which would be to the benefit of these people who are vulnerable consumers. So the impact, the possible impact of privatization would actually be that it might be positive for a vulnerable consumer in that they might have more competitive pricing, the quality of the goods and services they get might be better, and they would also be able to exercise their rights as consumers to choose their particular goods and services, as opposed to being limited by a set SOE that is providing that particular good or service.
The consumer is still one of the key stakeholders here. How do we address efficiency concerns without prejudicing vulnerable consumers?
Thank you for the question. So I think at the core of efficiency issues in most of our state-owned entities is the issue of bad corporate governance or lack of observation of good corporate governance practices. And I can come back to the Bangladesh example. When they started off with their nationalization journey, a lot of their SOEs became loss-making concerns, and this was due to corporate governance-related issues. So their management was not properly trained, they had excessive overstaffing, they had rigid wage structures. The SOEs also tended to thrive on huge subsidies from the state, and this really resulted in the national economy becoming strained and increasing corruption in Bangladesh. So the issue of bad corporate governance in the context of SOEs is not particularly unique to the South African context. It is something that we've seen happening in other jurisdictions, but I do not think that corporate governance needs to be addressed in SOEs alone. It's an issue that needs to be addressed in SOEs and the private role players that might come together in whatever structure or nuanced approach in order to give better services to vulnerable consumers. So in terms of how we can actually practically address these issues of efficiency, it would mean actually looking at the mechanisms that we already have in place and implementing them. So, for instance, looking into the King IV Code of Corporate Governance would mean that we need to make sure that in these boards of our SOEs, as well as the private entities, the board members need to be suitably qualified. They need to have the relevant experience. There needs to be a culture of good corporate governance that is cultivated with good ethics as well in that particular entity. And all of these things would contribute towards making sure that the entities are run more efficiently and sustainably, because the directors need to be aware of their duty to be good corporate citizens by making sure that they adhere to the laws that bind them individually, but also the laws that bind the specific SOE that they are heading up. Another example would be making sure that we actually enforce the mechanisms that we already have at our disposal. So, for instance, the Companies Act provides shareholders with the possibility of removing directors from boards subject to certain processes that are set out in Section 71. So instead of waiting for a company to be run to the ground before taking action against an individual director, the shareholders should rather take that into account and enforce those mechanisms so that the organizations can be run efficiently and sustainably, which ultimately would benefit the vulnerable consumer.
Don't forget to log on to our homepage, where there is an interesting article discussing the case for and against privatization in the South African context.